Good evening, everyone. Welcome to CPA Presents. My name is Mike Kaselniak. I'm the CPA Flight Safety Chair, and tonight's topic is spatial disorientation. Our speaker is Dr. David Schall. Dr. Schall is a retired Air Force colonel with 37 years of service, and he was a chief flight surgeon. He has flown over 42 different Air Force aircraft and has experienced half a dozen in-flight emergencies. He is board certified in Aerospace Medicine and ENT and is the former consultant to the Air Force Surgeon General. He is a frequent lecturer at EAA, CAP, and for the FAA. He has taught spatial disorientation at the Air Force's largest fighter training base and is a recipient of the Aerospace Medicine Association Kent Gillingham Award for outstanding contributions in the field of spatial disorientation. Thank you, Dr. Schall, for doing this presentation, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Let me see if I can get my screen shared here. I'm going to start off with a little video put out by one of the safety centers, and then I'll get into my presentation.
The sky is overcast and the visibility poor. That reported 5-mile visibility looks more like 2, and you can't judge the height of the overcast. Your altimeter says you're at 1,500 feet, but your chart tells you there's terrain in the area as high as 1,200 feet. Still, you've flown through weather like this before, so you press on. You find yourself easing back slightly on the controls to give yourself more clearance. Then, with no warning, you're in the soup. You peer so hard into the mist that your eyes hurt. You swallow, only to find your mouth dry. Somewhere a voice is saying, you should have turned back. You now have 178 seconds to live. You push the rudder and add a little pressure on the controls to stop the turn. But this feels unnatural, and you return the controls to their original position. This feels better, but now your compass is turning a little faster, and your airspeed is increasing. You scan the panel for help, but you don't find any. It doesn't make any sense. You're sure you'll break out in a few minutes, but you don't have a few minutes. You now have 100 seconds to live. You glance at your altimeter and are shocked to see it unwinding. You're already down to 1,200 feet. Instinctively, you pull back on the controls, but the altimeter still unwinds. The tack is in the red, and the airspeed's almost there too. You now have 45 seconds to live. Now you're sweating and shaking. There must be something wrong with the controls. Pulling back only moves the airspeed deeper into the red. You can hear the wind tearing at the airplane. You have 10 seconds to live. You see the ground. The trees rush up at you. You can see the horizon if you turn your head far enough. But it's at a strange angle. You open your mouth to scream.
So hopefully none of you will experience something like that. And, but it doesn't matter how experienced you are. The spatial disorientation is not a respecter of number of hours that you have. I've had a chance to fly as a flight surgeon in a lot of different aircraft, and especially in the high performance aircraft, your ability to experience some of these illusions is very prominent. And we spend a lot of time teaching pilots about how to avoid and recognize. As mentioned, I also am trained in ENT, and so understand vestibular problems very acutely. And I am a consultant to the Federal Air Surgeon as well for ENT conditions. So there have been quite a few famous spatial disorientation accidents, most recently Kobe Bryant's crash in Los Angeles in 2020. Of course, JFK's crash, we'll talk a little bit about that. A Twin Beach crash in Nebraska that had an international impact. And Jim Croce, of course, was a spatial disorientation crash, and Buddy Holly back in 1959. So it still continues to be a problem. And there are a lot of ways your body can lie to you. It can do it visually, or it can do it through your vestibular system. Black hole approaches are pretty classic. We'll talk a little bit about that. Autokinesis, where an object appears to be moving, but it's not. Some of the false reference or horizons, vection illusions, the leans, Coriolis, and a lot of pilots they just lump it up into, I've got vertigo. And when you tell me you have vertigo, that means a different thing. But for pilots, the term vertigo can also mean a lot of different things. And it could be something as simple as the leans, or it could be a somatogravic illusion where you're in a graveyard spiral. So we'll talk through a little bit about some of this stuff. So I don't know if we have any Navy pilots out there, but there's a very classic effect that they feel when they get ready to do a catapult launch. And one of the things that's beat into their head is that on the catapult launch, you keep your hand off the stick. And you'll notice that all good Navy pilots have their hand up on the canopy rail here, hanging onto the handle. And the reason for that is when you have that sudden acceleration, that acceleration is married with the 1G gravity, and it gives you a tremendous sensation that you're pitching up. And so your instinct immediately as you're coming off the end of the carrier deck is to push the stick forward to keep you from climbing and stalling. But you're not climbing and stalling. Your body thinks you're climbing and stalling. And so there's been many a Navy pilot early on who put himself in the drink and got run over by the carrier. So you keep your hands off the stick until you're well free of the carrier, and then you can put your hand back on the stick and continue flying. So this is a GXS illusion, and it can happen in general aviation aircraft. And we'll talk about a couple accidents where this occurred, and you wouldn't think that in just a little bug smasher, you could mess yourself up enough to crash your airplane. I love this Far Side cartoon showing cumulogranite clouds. And so these guys are a little bit lost. So SD accidents are underreported. A lot of times they don't get classified as spatial disorientation accidents. Of those that are reported, they make up about 10% of all accidents, but 90% of them are fatal. And most pilots think, well, I've never felt it. I haven't had a problem. I don't need to worry about it. Well, maybe you should. And the classic accident is that of a non-instrument rated pilot who flies into IFR, and the average survival time is about 3 minutes before you have a fatal accident. So no pilot is immune from spatial disorientation. A part of the problem is your ability to figure out your position relative to the Earth's surface. And part of that is, who do you trust? What do you believe what you see? Do you believe your sensations? Do you believe the flight instruments? And oftentimes your default mode is to your gut instincts and what you feel in the seat of your pants. We classify spatial disorientation as 3 types. Type 1 is the worst. That's where you're clueless and you don't even realize that you're spatial disoriented. And that often results in a fatality. Type 2, you recognize it as a problem, and you may or may not be able to break that situation. And type 3 is you recognize it, but you're overwhelmed and you're unable to do something about it. So we'll talk about what can you do about that. So your body lies to you in lots of different ways. What is reality? And how can you tell when your body's lying to you? And what are some strategies to recognize high-risk environments? So if you look at this, picture looks like the lines are all curved. But if you hold up a straight edge or a piece of paper to this, you'll find that all the lines are perfectly straight. Your eyes are lying to you. Is it true?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's just one illusion. Here's one with color. These boxes are exactly the same color, but if you put your finger up and cover up that horizon, you'll see that both of them are exactly the same. And your eyes are lying to you. You're not seeing correctly. So you're getting a lot of input from a lot of different parts of your body. You have Golgi tendon sensors, you have muscle spindle sensors, you have joint receptor sensors, mechanical skin sensors. All of these things are feeding information to your brainstem unconsciously and giving you a precept of where you are in space. Now, to see whether it was really true that you fly by the seat of your pants, there was a German flight surgeon back in World War I by the name of Hubertus Strugel, and he decided to numb his butt up. So he had a colleague inject a bunch of lidocaine all in his butt, and then he went up and flew and did acrobatics and to see if he got disoriented or not. Well, he got really sick. Now, I think it was probably lidocaine toxicity, but in any case, the seat of his pants didn't help him, and it made him very disoriented. So we're constantly getting information in. So our sense organs here, our eyeballs, our vestibular system are feeding information into our brain. And we also are getting information from flight instrument data that goes to the higher centers of our brain. And that gives us a precept of where we think we are consciously. And all of that results in an output in which we control the aircraft and decide which way it goes. But your emotions, emotional stress can mess you up in how you process information. And there are reflexes that you have that you just do unconsciously. So all of those things, you're taking information in visually, auditorily, as well as somatically in your processing. Many of you have pulled up to a stop sign and a car next to you starts to roll and you think you're the one that's moving and you immediately jump on the brake. Our simulators take advantage of this illusion and make you think that you're really flying and you're pulling G's, etc. And so both of these are very powerful inputs. But again, it's not reality. It's not what's happening. Those of you who have flown in helicopters over the water, the rotor downwash can create an illusion of movement, even though you're hovering still. And so you're trying to control the helicopter and keep it from moving when it's really not moving. And so you're introducing additional inputs that are not necessary. A lot of general aviation pilots think that clouds are all level. And so you can fly along thinking you're flying straight and level when in fact you're not. And so the clouds can lie to you as well. If you're taking out of Meadow Lake Airport and you decide to fly into O'Hare Airport in Chicago, runways are a little bit different in size. And so that difference in runway width can screw up your approach, because what you try to do is make that runway fit the size of your Meadow Lake runway, and you end up flying a very high approach into these runways, trying to make that sight picture fit. Similarly, if you have sloping terrain, if the terrain is upsloping away from the runway, you'll fly a much higher approach than if it's downsloping away from the runway, in which case you'll fly a lower approach below the glide path. If you fly in Alaska, they have these little tiny scrub pines up there. They're about a third or a fourth of the size of our pine trees down here in the lower 48. So if you're flying an approach into the runway and you're trying to make the trees fit the right size, you're going to be down in the trees or pretty close to them. And that can mess you up. Now, if you're flying around the Dayton, Ohio area, they have a model airplane runway that looks like a regular airfield. And in fact, the Air Force Academy has an auxiliary runway that they use for drone flying, etc. And you can be sucked into thinking that it's a real airport or a real runway. And when you get down to it, it doesn't work. Flying here around the mountains, it all depends on illumination. I'm down here in Colorado Springs, and around Pikes Peak, there are several smaller peaks that, depending on the lighting, you can see them or you can't see them. And so those peaks will be actually closer to you than you realize, and all of that is based on lighting. And so you really have to be aware about the terrain and the lighting, especially flying, in During winter, some of the flat lighting that can occur can really mess you up as to your altitude and your perception. So your eyeballs are connected to your vestibular system, both to the semicircular canals as well as the otoliths, and they can give you sensations that you're moving when you're actually not moving. One of my favorite stories is one of our F-15 pilots was flying at night and the planet Venus was out and it was very bright. And he thought that was the airplane he was supposed to rejoin on. And he flew for quite a bit and never actually caught up to the planet. And so before he realized that that was not an airplane. So but he swore it was moving. And so as you stare at an object long enough, it can look like it's actually moving. When you're flying at night, one of the worst things you can get into is where you have just a few lights on the horizon and then it merges into the sky. And so you can't really tell where that horizon is. And as you're looking, and especially if you're flying along a lake shore, et cetera, you can very quickly get into a black hole. And if you're flying VFR, you're just flying by the seat of your pants, you can get into some unusual attitudes and potentially get into a graveyard spiral or spin. So again, looking at the lights, you think you're oriented one way, and then all of a sudden you realize it's not quite what you thought. What's even worse is that if you're flying into an airport that has kind of a black hole approach, but there's a city off on the horizon, but it's on an upsloping terrain. And so it's not flat, but you try to make that city flat as you're flying your approach because you think it's flat. And that results in you flying a much lower below glide path approach to the runway and potentially impacting. So we're in constant movement. Down at the equator, you're moving at about 1,000 miles an hour. Up in Minnesota, it's about 733 miles an hour. And oh, by the way, we're speeding around the sun at about 67,000 miles an hour. And our solar system is moving around the galaxy at almost 500,000 miles an hour. And the Milky Way is traveling in space at over 800,000 miles an hour. And if you add all that up, it's over 1 million miles an hour that we're moving. So we're in constant movement. But it's what we call velocity. It's not accelerating. And so because it's a velocity, we don't sense that with our inner ear organs. Now, we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and we have these incredible sensors in the semicircular canal and inside the vestibule of the cochlea. This part is the hearing organ over here. And so this whole system can run off a hearing aid battery for 70 years. And it's quite exquisite. It will sense angular acceleration as you're going around a curve, but it also senses linear or straight line acceleration. And so this is sort of what it looks like anatomically. Here's your eardrum here, your middle ear bones, and buried in the densest bone in the body, what we call enchondral bone, are your semicircular canals. So here's the eardrum here, and up here you'll see the eardrum. And they've drilled out the mastoid to expose the semicircular canals. This is your facial nerve coming in that makes your face move around. And then they've opened up these canals so you can see the lateral, posterior, and superior semicircular canals. And that's where all this sensing for angular acceleration goes on. And inside, there are these little sails, and these sails will move as the inertia of the fluid pushes them. And oh, by the way, they're backing up each other. So each of these canals are aligned orthogonally to each other so that if one system drops offline, the other one can pick that up and provide input. This is especially critical for your eyeballs. So as you move your head and you're trying to track an object, it provides that input to the muscles in super real time. Meanwhile, linear acceleration is sensed by these organs called the otolith and the saccule. You really do have rocks in your head, and those little rock crystals provide the inertia on this bed of gel that cause these hair cells to sense movement. And you see these arrows and they show you the way that they sense movement in all these different directions. And so sometimes these little rock crystals will break loose and they'll fall into some of the semicircular canals. And that causes a condition that we call benign positional vertigo. And oftentimes, if you move your head on waking up, you'll suddenly have brief bout of vertigo or your eyes moving very quickly, and then it settles down. And there are some maneuvers that we can do to actually help you put those rock crystals back into the place where they belong. So I mentioned how the eyeballs are hardwired to the balance system. So in real time, it's sending constant information to your eye muscles so that you are able to track and have a smooth image across the screen. Now, when this system drops offline and you lose one of your balance organs suddenly, your eyeballs start jerking around, what we call nystagmus, and that can make you very dizzy and very nauseated. And so when this system goes haywire, it's not a fun time. And so you're pretty immobilized when it breaks down, but when it works, it's awesome. So in real time, you're constantly getting input that tells you where you are. All this visual, vestibular, somatic systems are giving you information about your body position. And then that turns into motors action. And so you decide what part of your body needs to move, whether it's your ankles, trunks, head, etc. And so this feedback is constantly feeding. In the environment of flight, that's not terra firma. And so how your body responds in flight is a little bit different. Now, these sensors sense acceleration, and they sense down to a level of about a half degree per second squared for pitch and roll, and about 0.14 for yaw. Now, the reason I say that is this is how you set yourself up for the leans. If you allow the wing to drop ever so slowly below the threshold of what your accelerometers can detect, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I've got a wing low, and you correct that suddenly, now you've done a super threshold input, and you thought you were level, and now you're correcting the level, but that doesn't feel right because what you thought was level was back over here. And so you lean to correct that. And that can be very powerful sometimes as you're sitting in the airplane and you look at the instruments, but it doesn't seem right. And the way you got into that situation is that you did it below the threshold of what you could sense. In linear acceleration, it's about a foot per second is what we can detect. So as I mentioned, you get the leans and it can really bother you, especially if you don't have a good horizon reference and all you have is your instruments. And now you're beginning to question your instruments and say, that doesn't seem right. And if you believe your body and you put that wing back down, now you're entering into a spiral. And over time, that spiral can tighten. And now you're into a graveyard spiral, which turns into a spin. And that's all she wrote. Now, for those of us who had the privilege of writing the human centrifuge, one of the things that the gondola does as it accelerates is that it lifts up horizontally. And now you're spinning around at very high speeds in a circle. And then when it slows down, you're getting input from two directions. You're getting one input that's going forward, and you're getting a second input that says you're dropping down. And when you do that, we call that cross coupling. And that makes you really dizzy. And so this points to head movement in the cockpit, especially when you're in a turn. If you've been in an airliner that's starting a descent turn and you start moving your head around to look out the window and see what's going on, and all of a sudden you get a little dizzy, well, that's what's going on. You're putting two inputs simultaneously into your balance organs, and it doesn't like that. And so you as a pilot, as you're beginning to do your turns, don't be jerking your head around, looking all over the place. You want to be careful about your head movements because you can give yourself vertigo by doing that. So sometimes when you're flying along, you may hit an updraft, and that may give you a sensation that the airplane's doing something that it's not doing. And so that can mess up your perceptions. And some of these are very powerful and they're hard to break. I was doing a flight in an F-15. I was in the back seat as a flight surgeon, and I was flying formation in the weather, and we were starting a turn to descent for our approach. And as I was following him, I swore that we were continuing to roll totally inverted. And because I was flying in the weather, you had to keep your eyes right on the airplane. You couldn't let him get away, because if he disappeared into the clouds, then you had to go lost wingman or et cetera. And so I'm looking at him and I'm fighting the sensation that we're upside down. And finally, I just had to say to the pilot, can you take it? Because I feel like we're upside down. And then immediately I could get my eyes on the instruments and realize we weren't upside down and got reoriented. But if you're flying by yourself, well, then you're going to have to break off, go lost wingman, or put it on autopilot, but you're going to have to do something to protect yourself and keep you from having false sensations. So we talked a little bit about the graveyard spiral and spin. This is the type of accident that JFK Jr. got into. And we'll talk a little bit about how he did that. But again, you see the pilot realizes that he's in a turn, he corrects it, but now he feels like he's turning in the opposite direction. That doesn't feel normal. So he rolls back into the turn that he was, because that makes him think that he's flying straight and level. And you get into this tightening spiral, and pretty soon you lose control. So how can we prevent this stuff? So there are a lot of different ways that you can break the chain. Part of that is procedures. Part of that is your instrumentation. You know, how big is your attitude indicator? And does it provide good information that you can readily interpret? How often are you used to flying on the instruments? Okay, doing proficiency. And if you start having an illusion or disorientation, having a good autopilot to let it fly the airplane while you get everything sorted out is a good backup. Or better yet, a co-pilot who hopefully is not experiencing the same problem. And there are courses around the country that teach unusual attitude and attitude upset training, and that can be helpful. Physiologic training with our vertifuge or other type of spatial disorientation trainer. And but basically recognizing those situations and where there's a high threat of spatial disorientation, and hopefully you're proficient in your instrument training. So one of the early trainers were these things called the Barony chairs. And it's always fun to watch the student pilots as you start spinning them around and you have them point, what direction are you turning? But once you get them, you're no longer accelerating them and you have them at constant velocity, then they hold their thumb straight up. They tell you they're not moving. That's because their sensors turned off and they don't detect movement because they're not accelerating. And then if you suddenly slow them down, they suddenly realize that they are turning, and now oftentimes it will make them a little bit dizzy. So these were part of our early training in World War I as we were testing the ability of pilots to sense acceleration, et cetera. These are some of the more modern spatial disorientation trainers that are out there. They do a pretty good job, but they can't reproduce all the illusions that you have out there. Back in the day, when some of our old fighters like the F-86, they used to have their transponder down between the legs of the pilot up front. And so as they were climbing out, they were often given a change in transponder code that they had to set. And so they put their head down into the cockpit to change that code. And that gave them the sensation that they were pitching up, and they pushed the stick forward. And we killed a lot of pilots just for squawk change back in the day. So they figured out if you move that box up higher in the cockpit where the pilot doesn't have to put his head down, things turn out better. One of the tools that have been developed is a thing called the Malcolm Horizon, and it's basically a red laser beam that goes across the cockpit, and you can calibrate it to wherever you want level to be in the cockpit. But the beauty of this is that it allows you to use your peripheral vision. And so you can detect small changes in attitude very early. And in fact, this worked very well in the SR-71 cockpit. A lot of the SR pilots use these Malcolm Horizons. And when you're going Mach 3, just a little bit of bank can put you in another country. And so having something that provides you, at a glance, you can tell, oh, it's not where it's supposed to be. It's too low or it's too high, or it's crooked. And in an instant, you can tell that you have an unusual attitude. So it was a very effective tool. We also looked at experimenting with sound localization. And so being able to tell, you had a certain tone that would tell you where the Earth was, and you had another tone that told you how fast you were going. And it provided some background information to you, but this assumes that you have normal hearing in both ears, number one, so that you can 3D localize exactly where the Earth is and how fast you're going. So E for effort, but that didn't take off very well. We now have night vision goggles that can magnify the lights up to 6,000 times. And, but they can also cause disorientation. Obviously you can see better, almost 20/20 at night with these, as opposed to without goggles, your vision is often 2200. And there's forward-looking infrared, which makes the night look like day. And so many of our EMS pilots will fly with either NVGs or FLIR to assist them in flying. And of course, there's terrain alerting warning systems that will help kind of keep you away from the dirt. And but at the end of the day, you're the most important piece of equipment in the aircraft. And making sure that you are up to speed and healthy and you're not on any drugs, etc. Your eyeballs are working the way they're supposed to, and that you don't have any cognitive or vestibular problems going on. But a lot of this stuff can sneak up on you. And one of the classic ones is glaucoma. I don't know how many of you actually go to an eye doctor at least once a year, but I tried to talk my dad into doing that. What do I know? I've only been a physician for over 40 years. And, but one day he noticed that he had a visual field cut. He couldn't see things over here. And he finally went to the eye doctor. Well, he had permanent vision loss due to glaucoma that could have been treated and could have been avoided. And the problem is that this is a slow blinder. It sneaks up on you and you don't know that you have it. It doesn't hurt. It's not painful. And pretty soon, all you can see is a soda straw. So if you got visual field cuts in both eyes in the same place, you're done flying. We're not going to grant you a waiver because you've got a blind spot that you can't see targets coming into your flight path. And so it's very important to go ahead and get your eyeballs checked at least once a year and make sure you don't have a problem with this. So we'll talk about some mishaps. We'll start with JFK's. JFK was unfortunately not a very high time pilot, and even worse, he was not instrument rated. But he had a high performance airplane, constant speed prop, retractable gear, and in fact, he'd only been signed off a couple of months prior. And typical of Murphy's Law, he had planned to fly during the day, but the ladies were late, and it ended up being a late afternoon, early evening takeoff, and now he's flying over the Atlantic Ocean. Now, mind you, he'd flown this over 35 times before, and so I got this. This is not a problem. But he's in a black hole, and he allows the wing to drop subthreshold, and he starts getting into a descent. And he sorts of recognize that something doesn't seem right. And it's one of those, you put the correct input in, it doesn't feel normal. You put the bad input back in, and you set yourself up into a descent. And so pretty soon he's descending at over 4,700 feet per minute. And it's a classic graveyard spiral. So other things that were factors were stress. Oh, by the way, he had just fractured his ankle 6 weeks ago. He's still using a cane. He was distracted. He flew across the flight path of an American Airlines flight that was coming in, had the wrong frequencies on the radio, and he didn't ask for help. And it's unfortunate and potentially preventable. This is a crash a number of years ago of a 747. So you got high time pilots that are flying these big jets. They're going into Guam, and it's a rainy day. It's a really rainy day, and it's at night, and the ILS is out. Okay, Murphy is starting to work here, and they're starting to get some spurious signals in the cockpit. Pilot was pretty fatigued, and it was a Korean crew. And if you know anything about the Koreans and Asian folks, you don't argue with authority. You respect your elders. And even if you see something abnormal, you're not allowed to speak or embarrass. And so the crew resource management in the cockpit is pretty poor. Oh, by the way, they were flying with outdated maps that showed the minimum safe altitude of 1,770 feet, when in actuality, it was higher. It was 2,150 feet. And Murphy was at it again. Their MSAW, their minimum safe altitude warning device, that wasn't working. And so they got into a black hole approach, and they're coming up on a long, thin runway with a slight upsloping, and they performed a shallow approach, and they didn't reach the runway. It did not turn out well. Over 228 people killed of the 254 folks on board. Again, another potentially avoidable spatial disorientation accident. Here's one involving a commuter taxi. And this particular pilot had a lot of hours, almost 3,000 hours, multi-engine, instrument rated. Was on the third leg of a 4-leg stop and got into the weather, entered a holding pattern, and because the airport was below minimums, had a 1/4 to 1 mile visibility in the early evening. It was offered an alternate, and after sitting in on the holding pattern for about 10 minutes, decided to accept it. And so she's on the final approach fix and 200 feet below, and continued down the glide slope and got down to about 400 feet and still could not see the runway. So executed a missed approach, climbed to 700 feet. And here she experienced that G-excess illusion that our Navy catapult pilots sense. And so as she was accelerating, doing her missed approach, she ended up pushing the nose down and entered a steep descent at 18 degrees nose low. And when you have this kind of disorientation, it takes the average pilot about 21 to 36 seconds to figure out something ain't right. Well, she only had 13 seconds and she didn't survive. And oh, by the way, she had some drugs on board. And so whenever you're involved in a fatal crash, the FAA has a toxicology kit that they usually send out to the scene. And in that, they can screen for everything, every over-the-counter drug, every prescription drug, et cetera. And she was taking a drug for migraine headaches called Fiorinol. She was on an antidepressant medication, Zoloft, and also on an anti-nausea medicine, Phenergan. All three of those will mess up your thought process, your reaction time, et cetera. So not a good idea to fly drugged, okay? It just requires too much faculty, too much processing, and the last thing you need to do is dumb it down or dull it. Here's another guy. This guy's a cardiologist. He's 67, and he's got a ton of hours. He's got over 11,000 hours and has just about every rating that you could potentially have. I mean, multi-engine instrument. He was a check pilot for the Civil Air Patrol and tow pilot, command pilot. And he was doing a humanitarian flight where they were flying someone to a medical center that needed a higher level of care. And they were heading back to, they had a meeting of the Civil Air Patrol that evening. And so they really wanted to get back to home base. But home base was covered in coastal fog. And they had been told at one of their stopovers that, hey, the weather's not real great where you're going. Why don't you spend the night here? No. We can do it. We can get there. So they pressed on. And sure enough, they got to the airport, did the approach, had to go missed. And as he was accelerating out, he had the sensation he was pitching up, pushed the nose down. Unfortunately, he was very close to the ground, killed 2 souls on board. And so, oh, by the way, he should have known better. He was on some cold medicine. And so that will dull your senses and your judgment. And he was also tired. He had been flying all day. And so both of those things, part of this is know when to quit and when to say, you know, it can wait. I don't need to go. There's nothing that important that I need to get myself. The worst place to be is up there wishing you were down there. This last case is one that changed the world. This involved a Beech Baron twin, and it was flown by an orthopedic surgeon out of Lincoln, Nebraska, and he was coming back from California. Unfortunately, he was not instrument rated. He only had 463 hours of time, only 100 hours in the type. And he, again, got a late start coming from California, and it was starting to get dark. There were storms across the plains. And as he got closer to Nebraska, there was a cloud deck. And so he dutifully stayed below the cloud deck. And as he was flying his airplane, he didn't realize, and he wasn't watching his altimeter spin down, that he was getting closer and closer to terra firma until he flew through a couple trees, which ripped his wings off and caused his plane to land in a patch of shrubs and then into a cow pasture. Now, unfortunately, his wife was thrown free of the aircraft because she had just taken her seatbelt off to turn and hand off the toddler to one of the kids in the back seat. So she was thrown free of the aircraft, was killed, but the other kids, there were 4 kids and him, survived. And now it's the middle of February, it's pretty cold, and he has 3 of his kids are unconscious. One has a broken arm, and he's kind of banged up, but he gets them and himself out of the airplane and does some first aid for them, and he waits. Now, back in the day, if your ELT went off, you could detect that there was a crash, but they wouldn't send search parties to the area where the ELT was. They had to go find the airports where you were planning to fly to, search those first before they went out. So out of Offutt Air Force Base, the big jumbo jet, the Looking Glass, had picked up the ELT and alerted, authorities that, hey, we've got an ELT, it's coming from this location. You need to go check it out. Well, he waited till about midnight and nobody showed up. And so he finally decided to go for help. And he's walking down rural farm roads. Finally, he flags down a car, and they come and they take his kids to a little community hospital there near Hebron, Nebraska. Well, the GP docs there didn't do a very good job. They're not protecting the kids' cervical spines. They're giving them sedatives when they're unconscious, and he just goes nuts. And he says, when I can do better care in a cow pasture than you guys can do in your little community hospital, there's a problem here, and this needs to change. And so out of that experience was birthed advanced trauma life support that has been taught to 1 million doctors worldwide and has saved countless lives as a result. And so all of this came about from a spatial disorientation accident. So I hope I've convinced you that your body lies to you in a lot of different ways, and that even experienced pilots can get themselves killed in spatial disorientation. There are some mitigating strategies that you can do to reduce the risk. And things aren't always as they seem. And I think this may have been photoshopped, but, and I'll do a shameless plug for those of you who've not had a chance to visit our National Museum of World War II Aviation. We have approximately 40 aircraft that are all in flying condition. And so a couple of them are famous. One was a movie star. It's the B-25, flew in the movie Pearl Harbor. And our P-38F model has 2 confirmed combat kills in the South Pacific. And in fact, this weekend, we're going to talk about the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and our Corsair is going to be flying as part of that talk this Saturday. So with that, I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you might have and go from there.
Dr. Schall, this is Mike Kaselniak. Back to the vestibular sensitivity. When you showed that ear canal and you went inside the, I don't know what it was called, but anyway, it looked like the first thing that came to my mind was a gyroscope.
Yes.
That's the first thing, because each of those little canals were going in different directions. So basically what we have in our head is a gyroscope, right?
We have
something like that.
Gyroscopic sensors, and they're at 90 degrees to each other and also across from each other. So they back each other up, and they're perfectly placed in your skull. And so I have a hard time with people who believe in evolution, that only the people who had one of those sensors, didn't make it, or the people who had 3 of them didn't make it. Only the people who had 2 perfectly placed, orthogonally placed sensors in the densest bone in the body were the ones that evolved out of primordial sludge. So we have yet to build a laser gyro that is that small, that sensitive, that runs off that low of energy. And so it's an incredibly well-designed device.
Yeah, it's amazing. The other thing I wrote down here when you were talking about the rock crystals, are they actually a crystalline rock, or do you just call them that?
They're calcium oxalate crystals, and they're embedded in a gel. And so that little gel bed holds those rock crystals, and it creates a sheet. And so as you accelerate, that inertia pulls the sheet backwards, bends those hair cells, and that's what fires and lets you know, okay, you're accelerating in that direction. And so it provides that input. Now, if you get in a car crash and your head gets thrown around, you can break loose some of those crystals out of the gel bed. And some of those crystals can now float into places where they don't belong. And they can cause problems with dizziness or vertigo.
I can't wait to tell my grandkids they got rocks on their heads.
There you go.
That's pretty good. And you talked about that on the SR-71, that red laser that went across the
Malcolm Horizon. Yeah.
Yeah. Was that laser in the cockpit, or was it connected to something on the outside?
No, it was inside the cockpit above the pilot's seat. It came from above. And then they had controls that they could adjust where they wanted it for their comfort to represent the horizon. This is level flight.
Okay.
So you could put it at the bottom of your attitude indicator, but you knew where level flight was. So if it was out of that position, then you knew, you were going down or you're going up. But more importantly, it provided peripheral input. So even out of the corner of your eye, you could tell whether you were level or not level, et cetera.
Okay, so somehow it rotated inside the cockpit?
Well, so it rotated the beam. So
Okay, all right. Because I always thought if it was stationary in the cockpit, no matter what the plane was doing, it would do what the plane was doing. Okay, okay,
So was it driven by a gyro?
okay.
Was the laser driven by a gyro?
Correct.
No,
any
that's,
questions, feel free to take yourself off mute. Also, just let everybody know if you haven't used the form, I just put it in the chat again. That's the form to sign up to get the fast credits for the session. One of the tricks that my instrument flight instructor gave me, which I think is just completely invaluable, is to always carry. I'm instrument rated. I'm low instrument time of actual time. Because learning to fly out here, it's like the days that I can tell you the 2 days that the weather is going to be perfect for instrument flying. I usually have to work on one of those days, and the other day the freezing level is usually at the ground, so neither one of those will actually work. But he recommended carrying the foggles with me at all times, and if I'm actually in IMC conditions, to go ahead and put the foggles on, because now I'm in a state of where I learn to fly, and it helps me focus. And the few instrument hours that I do have, I've done that, and it is super helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, it is a technique. In the military, we beat instrument flying into our pilots. And so, you learn to trust those instruments, and that's what you fly by. In fact, most of your procedures are all done on instruments. And so you do very little VFR flying, so to speak. It's always on the instruments. It's on the instruments. And that's, you learn to adapt and become one with the instruments. And whereas I think in general aviation, it's always kind of a nice day out. The instruments are an accessory. And so you don't always rely on them nor trust them. And part of that is, again, building those habits and those reflexes, so to speak, where you're comfortable and you don't have to do extra stuff to make yourself comfortable.
I had a old time pilot friend of mine back in New Hampshire tell me, wear a necklace. And if you get stuck somewhere, you put the necklace somewhere in the cockpit and it'll tell you if you're going left or right, up or down. I thought that was a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
That or a bobblehead.
Yep, there you go. What suggestions would you give to CFIs to not to train their students, but to give more insight about spatial disorientation to their students?
Well, first of all, I would try to beat into their heads that spatial disorientation can kill you. And there are certain scenarios that will set you up for that. So if you're doing night flying, for example, because you got to do a particular night cross country or whatever, that's a high risk environment. And so you need to really be comfortable with what the instruments are telling you and how to do an appropriate scan of the instruments and recognize that, yeah, they're all agreeing. Or, the other part is we teach them partial panel. So in a sense, sometimes the instruments don't work, or, the vacuum tube is stuck, or your pitot is stuck, or you got whatever. And so it kind of creates a little bit of mistrust because, well, maybe the instruments aren't working. Maybe they are lying to me. And so, getting them to an area where they learn how to trust kind of the compendium, the composite picture that you get from all the instruments, not just one instrument, that you look at your turn and bank, you look at your attitude indicator, you can look at your VVI, you can look at all of that's providing you information. And can you process that quick enough to be able to tell that you're maintaining level flight or you're not, et cetera, or that one of those instruments isn't working? So flying into night, obviously flying into clouds, IFR, when inadvertently, you thought you could make it, now you can't. So, part of that is recognizing it's okay to say, all right, time to turn around, do 180, get out of there. Don't stay in that area because it will kill you. And if you're not proficient And the small airplane that you're in, you're more likely going to be tossed about. Many of those clouds are turbulent. And so now your plane is being thrown around and you can get into an upset situation. And so recognizing and teaching them that, hey, these are the scenarios that you potentially could get into big trouble. And you need to do your homework ahead of time. You need to know how to be proficient on the instruments. You need how to learn how to do the scan. You need to know when to call for help. And so it's all okay to call outside help. Air traffic control can help you with vectors. They can also help you, if you're in trouble. Sometimes some of those guys are pilots and they can kind of talk you through some of the things that you can do. If you're lucky enough to fly an airplane with an autopilot that you trust, put the autopilot on, okay, until you can get your head back in the game and correct that.
Yeah, I had an incident in Vermont. I was flying a Piper Tomahawk. I think my daughter was maybe 8 years old with me, and we attended a seminar on aviation in Vermont. And the front was coming in, and people were leaving. And I said to my daughter, "Okay, time to go." And we got out of the airport, and we ran in the clouds. And I said to my daughter, "Can you see the ground?" She goes, "No." And I could see the altimeter starting to spin, so I turned around. As stupid as it was, I did another attempt. It didn't work. We landed. We spent the weekend in Vermont. But
You're here.
yeah, I'm here. So is my daughter.
Yeah. So that gets into, aeronautical decision making. And had an airman who had a history of ADHD. And so we sent him for some neuropsych testing, and his testing said he didn't have ADHD anymore, but he was an engineer. And on his bucket list was he wanted to buy an airplane and fly it across the United States. And so he did. He made it all the way to the East Coast from California. And now he's heading back to the West Coast. And he's in Ohio. And there's a whole band of thunderstorms ahead of him. And he's looking at his radar on his iPad, and he sees a sucker hole. He sees a break in the thunderstorms, and he thinks he can weave his airplane through there. FBO guys are like, hey, no, come back tomorrow. You can fly tomorrow. Just, FBO guys went home. He stayed with his airplane. I think I can do it. And so off he goes. Unfortunately, the information was 5 minutes out of date, or 10 minutes, or 15 minutes, depending on who you believe. And by the time he got up there, his plane got picked up by those cumulogranite clouds and dashed into the ground. And that's all she wrote. So, again, if your gut's telling you this is a bad idea, it's probably a bad idea.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, the first time that I took my wife into actual, I wasn't anticipating a deep cloud bank. The ceilings were reported to be about 8,000 feet, and I needed to climb up to maybe 9. So I expected just a short time to go through the clouds to come out on top. And we got up to about 8,500 feet or so, and I asked her, I was like, "So are we clear of the clouds?" And her response was what I wasn't expecting it. She goes, "Well, what does that look like?" And I'm like, well, we shouldn't see any clouds. And I already had my foggles on by that point in time. And because she couldn't really describe what the situation was, I flipped them up real quick and looked, and I'm like, "Oh no, we're still solid." The unfortunate part is the forecast was wrong. So I wound up flying for nearly 3 hours IMC, all hand flying in a 172.
That's painful.
And the unfortunate part is that I was committed at that point in time, because the plane doesn't fly necessarily true. And at any point, I mean, even changing the radio frequencies would start me into a slight turn and a slight descent to the left. So it was exceptionally challenging to maintain straight and level. The fortunate part is that my next stop was a home airport that I know the approach procedure by the back of my hand. So I wasn't terribly worried about the destination, but it still was, I learned a lot out of that particular session on maybe a little bit more briefing of the passenger, and have a little bit more, a few more options in my bag rather than, we're just going to pop out on top and I'll be good to go.
Well, and that gets to, that other point of, are they an effective co-pilot for you? Do they know how to change the radios? Do they know how to change the transponder? Do they know how to transmit on the radio if you get into trouble? And a lot of that stuff is, a good ground briefing ahead of time to say, hey, I want to show you a couple things on the panel here. Here's what this instrument does. And, if I get really busy and I need your help, I may ask you to change the squawk on the transponder to 7,700. I'm in trouble or whatever. And, but the time to do that is on the ground, not while you're in the air trying to fly and talk to them and give instructions, et cetera. And so one of the things that in flying high performance jets that they always beat into our heads is you practice emergencies. Every single sortie we went out on, there was a boldface emergency that we would practice. And so today is we're simulating an engine fire, or today we have a gear problem. Gear won't come down or go up or whatever, or we've got a fire in the engine, or et cetera. But every single mission we went on, we'd go to that page, we'd simulate the procedures, learn where the switches were, circuit breakers, et cetera. And so when real things happened, it wasn't scary. It wasn't a big deal. I've seen this before. We can get through this. I don't see that in GA pilots. GA pilots don't think about that kind of stuff, frankly, because, nobody wants to have an emergency. But I had to learn to sort through the emergency is ahead of time, okay? If you haven't looked at that page that tells you, what are you going to do if you do have an engine fire? What are the procedures? I'm flipping through the pages. I'm not sure what part of the boldface checklist it's in. And that's not the time to learn about that emergency. The time to do that is ahead of time. And so on every sortie that you go out on, think about practicing one of the boldface on your checklist. And so where that circuit breaker is, where those handles are, what your options are. And then if you want to read more about it on the ground, you can go to the owner's manual and go to that whole section and learn about hydraulics or learn about electrical or all of that other stuff. And some of the best pilots I flew with knew those aircraft systems like the back of their hand. And there was not a lot of stuff that you could surprise them with. And because they understood the airplane and they were comfortable with it. Some of the guys I flew with were so good that in the F4, you have a whole battery of instruments for the engines, et cetera, but they would recognize the patterns of where those needles needed to be pointed. And they could instantly detect if one of those needles was not where it was supposed to be. And the other thing is they could tell the speed of the aircraft just by the sound of the air flying over the canopy. And so they could sense if they were getting slow or they were getting too fast. And they were amazing to fly with. These guys were so good.
Yeah. We've got a question from someone in the room. Any literature that you would recommend?
Most of the detailed stuff on spatial disorientation is pretty heavy medical. And, you can find some good chapters in some of the pilot training books, but they're usually about a page and a half, 2 pages, and that's kind of it. And so one of my goals when I retire this fall is to write a book on spatial disorientation for the general aviation pilot. It's kind of SD for dummies, and with lots of pictures and explanations and examples of those types of things. So stay tuned. Maybe next year my book will be out, and it'll help you with some of those questions.
We can have a book release party.
There you go. Other questions?
If you guys are on mute, feel free to unmute yourself.
So was this helpful? Did you learn anything from anything that you were exposed to that you didn't appreciate before?
The gyros in my head and the rocks.
And the rocks in my head.
Yeah.
You know, we've been telling you, Michael, for a long time. I mean,
So what's fun is when you do ear surgery and you go remove the third little ear bone from the foot plate, you can actually look inside the vestibule and you can see those little tiny rock crystals that are in there.
Oh my God.
And it's absolutely amazing. I mean, it's like, wow, they really are there and you can see them. And you need a microscope, obviously, to do that, but
Yeah.
it's pretty impressive.
Wow. That's pretty cool.
are there, I'm trying to think of how to frame the question. Are there ear issues that pilots can recover from if they've, like a medical issue that they could encounter, but through surgery or medicine or something like that, that would allow them to get back into it if there was something that caused them to have to stop?
So I get to review a lot of ear cases for the FAA, and there are a lot of different things that can go wrong with the ear and the inner ear, et cetera. And for example, there's a condition called Meniere's disease, which is basically an overpressure of the inner ear system, what we call cochlear hypertension. And that causes a fluctuating hearing loss as well as vertigo that can be very violent, and it can make you barf your brains out. And obviously, as a pilot, that's not a good thing to have. If you're a military pilot, you get Meniere's disease, your flying career is over. But in the FAA, and now lately with treatments that we have available, we can actually manage that condition. There's an antibiotic called gentamicin, and in low doses, it selectively poisons the balance hair cells and not the hearing hair cells. So you can knock out that balance system on that side that's not operating properly and get control of the vertigo. And so after a 6-month observation period, we've allowed some of those pilots to go back to flying when previously their career would be over. And so, and there are a lot of different other ear procedures that we can do nowadays to help people get back to flying. In fact, for people who are deaf, we can put cochlear implants in there that are electrodes inside the inner ear that code neurally for hearing. And so we put out probably a half a dozen airline pilots that are flying with cochlear implants that can, that's their sole source of hearing, is that cochlear implant. And they've done very well.
Do those cochlear implants have the Bose adapter, or do they use the regular phone adapters? It's
So
a joke. It's meant to be a joke.
Capabilities with Bluetooth. So
Bluetooth, there you go, even better.
you can Bluetooth both your phone or the comm panel to your cochlear implant. And I had one general aviation pilot who happened to be a senior AME examiner. He had bilateral cochlear implants, and he had Bluetooth his comm package, and then he'd wear his headset around his neck so he could use the mic and when he transmitted. But one day he was flying a standard instrument departure out of Fort Worth, and he hit some really severe air turbulence, so severe that it knocked the magnets that hold his cochlear implant processor on his head, caused him to drop. And now he's an ortho. He's scrambling to find the magnets and get them back on. And so he had a few altitude deviations while he was scrambling in the cockpit. He got beat up by ATC for that, but he now wears a ball cap to hold the magnets in plane that he flies. So that didn't happen again.
And here I was trying to make a pithy joke. Wasn't an ear issue that caused Alan Shepard to have trouble getting back into space?
In fact, he had Meniere's disease. And he went out to the House Ear Institute and they whisked him in under an assumed name. And they did an experimental operation on him, what they called an endolymphatic sac decompression procedure. And basically that relieves the extra pressure in that inner ear system. And it worked very well. It cured his Meniere's disease so much so that he was added back onto the Apollo crew and got to actually go all the way to the moon. And so it was an incredible success story.
Wow, that is awesome. Mhm. That's amazing. Wow. Mhm.
I didn't realize that was, I mean, I knew that there was something ear related that caused him to not be able to go, so, or be able to fly for a while.
Right.
Wow.
Absolutely.
He was quite determined.
Had the right stuff. Come on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Mhm. Mhm. Any other questions for Dr. Schall out there? Okay. All right.
I guess I answered it. It was a great presentation.
Yeah, no, it was very good. Very good, Dr. Schall. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I enjoy doing this and be happy if people think of questions later on, they can email me and
Okay.
go from there.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And excellent presentation.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
thank you.